right, let's dive in. We've got this book, Deconstructing the Patriarchy, a framework for harmonious gender relations. And it looks like you're really interested in how the author tackles covert contracts and the history of societal institutions, right?
Yeah, those are some big themes in the book for sure. We'll be looking at how they connect to the digital world, the pressures on men today, and how to, redefine success for the next generation.
Sounds like we've got a lot to cover. The book starts off with a pretty, I guess you could say, a stark look at the dangers of the digital world, especially for kids. There are some stats in here that are, well, pretty alarming. Like, did you know 1 in 7 teenagers have received unwanted sexual advances online?
It's a serious problem, and the book goes deeper than just the numbers. It really gets into the tactics these predators use, which is pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, it's not just about knowing they're out there. It's about understanding how they operate.
Exactly. Like, there's this tactic called false mirroring, where a predator pretends to share a child's interests, builds that connection and trust. They might even make fake profiles to seem younger. And it's tough for parents to catch because it often happens in spaces that seem totally harmless.
That's scary stuff. Really highlights why it's so important to talk to your kids about what they're doing online. But the book also goes beyond the dangers and looks at how social media impacts, well, masculinity and how traditional male roles are often portrayed negatively in the media. Makes you think about how that might be shaping the way young men see themselves.
Definitely. The author argues there's this shift away from valuing traditional masculine traits. Strength, stoicism, being a protector, those kinds of things. There's this push towards a more feminized ideal, and it leaves a lot of men feeling lost, unsure of where they fit in.
I can see how that could lead to some real inner conflict.
Yeah.
So how does this idea of redefining success fit in?
Well, the book argues that those traditional markers of success, a career, providing for your family, being a leader in your community, they're being, I guess you could say, downplayed. The focus is on things that are more fleeting, like social media fame or just having a lot of stuff. And the author says this is leading to a generation that's chasing superficial goals and missing out on the deeper values that actually bring fulfillment.
It makes you wonder if that constant pressure to achieve, to be successful, is part of why so many men are feeling anxious and uncertain these days. But the book doesn't just dwell on the problems, it offers some solutions too, right?
Absolutely. And that's where the author's ideas about red pill parenting come in. It's about parents, especially fathers, being proactive in teaching their sons about the real world, giving them the skills and values they need to thrive.
So it's not just protecting them from the negative stuff, it's about empowering them to navigate it all. Can you give us an idea of what that might look like in practice? What does red pill parenting actually mean?
Well, one thing the book talks about is teaching boys practical skills. Things like basic home repair, car maintenance, even managing your finances. Skills that were traditionally passed down but maybe aren't as common now.
Right. It's about giving them those tools to be independent and resourceful, which are valuable no matter what path they choose. The book also takes a pretty strong stance on the patriarchy. What's the author's take on that?
This might challenge some conventional thinking. The author says that the patriarchy, while not perfect, provided stability and order in society, historically speaking. He contrasts that with what he sees as the modern feminist narrative, which often demonizes men and traditional roles.
That's a bold statement. How does he back that up?
He dives into the history of institutions like marriage, family, government, and argues that they developed under a patriarchal system. And while it wasn't always perfect, it generally protected and provided for women and children. He also points out that a lot of the advancements women have today, like voting or owning property, were achieved within that system. He's not saying we should go back to some idealized past, but he's encouraging people to look at history in a more nuanced way, to see that progress doesn't always mean tearing down everything that came before.
It sounds like he's asking us to re-examine our assumptions about gender and power. And that brings us to the topic you mentioned earlier, covert contracts and relationships. Can you tell us more about what that means and why it's important?
Sure. Covert contracts are basically unspoken expectations and agreements in relationships. They often come from traditional gender roles, but they're not out in the open. They're rarely talked about.
So it's not necessarily the roles themselves that are the problem. It's whether they're chosen freely and consciously by both partners.
Exactly. The author's encouraging readers, especially men who might be feeling stuck or unhappy in their relationships, to look for any hidden expectations that might be at play in their own lives. It's about bringing those things out in the open and having honest conversations about what each person wants and needs.
It seems like a critical step towards making relationships more fulfilling and equal. But how do you actually find those covert contracts? I mean, they're covert for a reason, right?
The author gives some helpful ways to think about it. He says men should start by asking themselves some questions. What are the unspoken expectations in this relationship? What am I giving? What am I getting back? Is it really equal? Or am I always putting in more?
Those are some tough questions, but important ones. It sounds like the first step is really about self-awareness, being honest with yourself about what you need and expect from the relationship. We've covered a lot of ground, but we're just scratching the surface of this book. There's still so much more to explore, like red pill parenting, navigating the legal system, building a strong support network.
Yeah, there's a lot more to dig into. And we'll be doing just that in the next part of our deep dive.
So before we were talking about how to spot those hidden expectations in relationships, the covert contracts that can throw things off balance. But this book goes beyond just romantic relationships, right? It talks about how those kinds of unspoken agreements can exist in society as a whole.
Yeah, the author argues that a lot of the institutions we just, take for granted, school, the legal system, even the media, they've been shaped by certain ideologies that often work against men's interests. He uses this phrase, captured institutions, to describe how these systems that were, originally meant to serve everyone have been kind of taken over and are now pushing a specific agenda.
Captured institutions. That's a pretty strong image. It makes you think, like, who's doing the capturing and and what are they trying to achieve? Can you give us some examples of how this actually plays out?
Sure. One example the author talks about is family courts. He says the system is biased toward mothers in custody cases, often giving them primary custody and more of the assets, even when the father is, a good parent who's involved in the kids' lives. He says this bias comes from this deep-seated belief that women are just naturally better at nurturing and raising kids, which he sees as a harmful stereotype that hurts fathers and prevents kids from having both parents actively involved.
That's definitely a controversial topic, but it's something a lot of guys, especially in the manosphere, are talking about. It seems like this book is saying those concerns are valid, at least when you look at it from a historical and societal perspective. What about education? How does the author see that as a captured institution?
He argues that the way we educate kids now, especially in the West, has been really influenced by feminist ideology. Things like using gender-neutral language, focusing on empowering girls, and kind of downplaying traditional male roles and accomplishments. He says this creates a learning environment where boys feel ashamed of being masculine and where their needs and learning styles aren't being met.
It's interesting because you hear so much about the problems girls face in school, but this book is saying boys are struggling too, just in different ways. It's a perspective you don't often hear. Does the author offer any solutions for dealing with these captured institutions? Can they even be, reclaimed?
He doesn't have any easy answers, but he encourages men to just be aware of these forces and to actively push back against the narratives that are hurting them. He talks about supporting men's rights groups, speaking out against injustice, and creating alternative institutions that actually meet men's needs.
So it's about recognizing that these systems exist and then, working within them or even creating new systems to achieve a more balanced and fair approach to gender. It's a call to action. Not just to sit around and complain, but to actually do something. And that ties into his emphasis on personal responsibility and self-improvement. He doesn't want men to just be victims of these systems, right? He wants them to empower themselves.
Exactly. He says that even though men face challenges because of the way society is structured, they still have the power to take control of their lives. He talks about being physically fit, financially independent, and having a strong sense of purpose. Those are the keys to empowerment. By focusing on those things, men can build resilience and confidence. That's what they need to deal with the complexities of the modern world and push back against anything that tries to undermine them.
It's a message of self-reliance, but also working together, realizing you're not alone in this, and there are other guys fighting for the same things. It's about building a community and creating positive change. And speaking of community, the book talks about the importance of men connecting with each other, having those strong bonds and mentoring relationships. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, the author says men are wired for connection. They do better in environments where they can build strong bonds with each other. He talks about how men's groups have been important throughout history, from ancient warrior societies to things like fraternities and sports teams. These bonds have always been a part of men's lives. He argues that now, when men are often isolated and disconnected, it's even more important to create spaces where they can connect, share their experiences, and support each other's growth.
It's not just about, having friends, right? It's about having your tribe, your brother, guys who understand you on a deeper level. And that goes hand in hand with mentorship, doesn't it? Having those older, more experienced guys to guide you.
Yeah, he sees mentorship as a crucial part of how men develop. Young guys need role models who can teach them what they need to know, not just in their careers, but in their personal lives and relationships too. It's about finding mentors who have the qualities you admire, who can give you guidance and support.
It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron. You need those strong, supportive relationships to help you be your best. And it's not just about being mentored, it's about mentoring others too, as you gain experience and wisdom. It creates this cycle of support and growth. The book also tackles some sensitive topics like false accusations and the way men are portrayed in the media. How does the author approach those issues?
Well, he says men are often unfairly portrayed negatively in the media, and that this can really impact their lives, especially in things like family court and the workplace. He encourages men to be aware of these biases and to challenge them. He also talks about false accusations and how even though they're statistically rare, they can be devastating for the guy who's accused. He says men need to take steps to protect themselves, like being careful about their interactions with women and documenting any disagreements they might have.
So it's a reminder that even as we're working towards a better, more just world, we still need to be aware of the dangers and take care of ourselves. Be proactive in making positive changes, but also in protecting ourselves. We've covered a lot in this part, from captured institutions to the importance of those male bonds and mentorship. There's this recurring theme of men taking responsibility for their own lives, building their own communities, and pushing back against systems that don't have their best interests in mind.
And in the next part, we'll explore how these themes connect to the author's main argument about redefining what masculinity means in the digital age, and how to build a future where men and women can have relationships that are more harmonious and fulfilling.
We've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Masculinity, relationships, all these forces that are shaping society. So where does it all lead? What kind of future does the author see?
Well, he ends on a kind of cautiously optimistic note. He thinks that even with all the challenges men face, there's this growing awareness and a movement building to address them. He sees a way forward, a path that involves redefining masculinity in a way that respects those traditional strengths, but also adapts to the modern world.
So it's not about like throwing the good out with the bad, more about evolving, right? Finding that balance between what worked in the past and what we need now.
Yeah, exactly. He talks about reclaiming the positive aspects of traditional masculinity. You know, things like courage, responsibility, leadership, being a protector, but also developing the emotional intelligence and communication skills that are so important for relationships today.
It's like he's calling for a more well-rounded approach to manhood. One that recognizes all of it, the strengths and the vulnerability.
Right. And he believes that this more integrated masculinity, it's not just good for men themselves, it's good for everyone. When men are empowered to be their best, they can contribute more to their families, their communities, the world.
It's interesting because it sounds like he's talking about a kind of masculinity that benefits everyone, not just men. It's about creating a better society for everyone.
Exactly. He thinks the way to get to true equality between men and women isn't to try and erase the differences, but to understand and appreciate them. And then find ways to work together, with respect and
It's
cooperation.
a vision of partnership instead of competition, recognizing that we all need each other.
And that brings us back to this idea of harmonious gender relations, which is really what the author's ultimately aiming for. He believes that if we can get rid of those harmful ideas that pit men and women against each other, and instead build understanding and empathy, we can create a future where everyone flourishes.
It's a hopeful message for sure, but it takes work, right? Both individually and as a society.
Definitely. It's about challenging our own biases, having those tough conversations, and working together to create systems that support healthy relationships. It's not a quick fix, it's a long-term commitment to making things better.
And this book gives us a way to start, a framework for approaching this work in our own lives and in the world around us.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who wants to dive deeper into all of this, I highly recommend checking out Deconstructing the Patriarchy. You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.